About 20 years ago, a group of us were on a canoe trip in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. So many of you are familiar with it. It was evening, though I didn't know what time it was because we had left our watches in our cars when we went out on the water. The night was clear and a bright full moon shone through the trees. There was no wind and the lake was smooth as glass. Several of us, my son and I included, decided to paddle in the moonlight. Our canoes slid across the water, the paddles quietly propelling us along. The tall pine trees seemed to reach to the stars, but their reflections on the quiet lake dove to the depths. I was struck by the awesome grandeur of that place. In my lifetime, I've been in many churches, from beautiful Gothic cathedrals to the Frank Lloyd Wright Meeting House of the Unitarian Society in Madison. But none of them evoked the same sense of awe and wonder that I felt that night. Now, I grew up in a conventional, middle-of-the-road Lutheran faith. If asked, I suppose that for at least some part of my life I would have responded that I believed in God. I didn't give a lot of thought concerning the nature of God, and I didn't really struggle with the concept. God was just, well, God. To be sure, I had my doubts. I couldn't figure out why this God would cast all those folks who didn't believe in him, in those days long ago it was always him, into eternal punishment, even if they didn't have a chance to believe in Christianity. It made no sense to me that good deeds didn't count unless they were motivated by a belief in Jesus. I guess I was one of those Unitarian Universalists who didn't realize it at the time. Ultimately, after attending Luther College and studying the Bible and religion, I decided that the question of God was not all that important compared to the important issues of the day: the civil rights movement, war and peace, and environmental degradation. And so while I retained an academic interest in religion, an artifact of my long childhood involvement in church, the central issues of faith didn't really concern me. For over 18 years, I drifted in this world outside of the church and away from religion. I missed the sense of community and tried to find substitutes. But the ultimate questions of God and faith continued to elude me. In 1988, I discovered Unitarian Universalism, a religion that fit my temperament and my beliefs. I joined up, but I was puzzled. How could you have a religion where the notion of God was apparently optional? Now, don't get me wrong. This was a wonderful discovery. I'm pretty much a rationalist, and all the conventional ideas of God leave me cold. And here was a religion that did not require me to check my skepticism at the door. But coming out of a conventional theistic religious background, at a gut level, the idea of a religion without God made no sense. Now, as a Unitarian Universalist, I didn't feel like I had to dwell on such theological questions, and I simply let them pass me by. Since I had been more of an institutionalist when it came to church, I felt I could function quite well without having a coherent theology. As long as I made the trains and the board meetings run on time, no one really would want to know what I thought about God. Of course, ultimately this caught up to me. While I could, in theory, be board president without a developed theology, if I tried to do that as a minister, sooner or later I was going to be found out. So I began to refine my own thoughts about that which is ultimate. I could not bring myself back to the notion of God. I read a number of writers who struggled with this question and tried to develop alternate definitions that made the idea of God palatable to someone like me who rejected the traditional God of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. If you don't believe this struggle, look at my bookshelf. But I found that these arguments were not compelling nor really worth the intellectual effort. I decided I did not need the idea of God in my life to be a religious person. Now, I pretty much have rejected calling myself an atheist, though truth be told, that's how most would probably describe my beliefs. And I have many reasons for this. The first is visceral. In the world and time in which I grew up, Lake Wobegon in the 1950s and 60s, atheist was one of the worst things you could be called. It probably wasn't safe. Certainly it would have sent my parents to an early grave, particularly in the McCarthy and post-McCarthy era when I grew up. And in fact, it may not be safe today if you look at some of the polling data. Second, in my opinion, public atheists have given atheism a bad name. Madalyn Murray O'Hair, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens often present a strident, unyielding atheism which rejects any form of religious expression, not just as being wrong, but as being downright dangerous. I find much of their rhetoric to be as distasteful as that of other modern-day religious extremists. And finally, for me, the word atheist suggests a level of certitude about God that I cannot muster. I prefer the term non-theist, which suggests one who personally rejects the idea of God, as opposed to one who says definitively there is no God. A distinction without a difference? Perhaps, but it's one I can live with. Ultimately, for me, the problem with the terms atheism, non-theism, and the like are their negativity. They told me what I did not believe, but they did not give me a positive theology on which to ground my practice of ministry. And so enter religious humanism. I'm not sure when I was first consciously aware of this religious outlook. Certainly I had heard the term humanist before. In our popular culture, the phrase secular humanist is often used pejoratively to describe people who want evolution taught in the schools and who don't think the courthouse is a proper venue for the Ten Commandments. In our Unitarian Universalist churches, the word is often modified by the phrase cranky old to describe those older, often male parishioners who visibly cringe at the mention of God or Jesus or prayer. But as described in Reverend Bill Murray's book, Reason and Reverence, religious humanism is a viewpoint that looks to the world of here and now for meaning, without the need for a supernatural realm to validate our existence. The 19th century world of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution gave rise to humanism, which gives science and the scientific method a central place in the religious enterprise. The scientific worldview stands in contrast to the world of the traditional Orthodox Christian faith. In traditional Christianity, the creation was the work of a divine God, and humanity's task was to reflect His glory. We humans were at the center and the apex of the universe. But the work of Copernicus and Galileo in astronomy, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in biology, and ultimately the Big Bang theory and quantum physics changed all that. Gone was the divine creator as a being. Creation itself became part of a long and gradual process that took billions of years. The mechanism for evolution proposed by Darwin, Wallace, and others, natural selection, had an elegant randomness. Those mutations that periodically throughout evolutionary time, plants and animals would mutate. Those mutations that successfully adapted to the environment survived, and those that did not adapt became extinct. Humans were simply one expression of the evolutionary process, their larger brains and our opposable thumbs, giving us certain evolutionary advantages. Evolution gave us characteristics that allowed us to survive in a hostile environment, even though we lacked many of the physical capabilities of other species. Recent discoveries in biology, chemistry, and physics support these theories. In biology, the discovery of DNA and the unraveling of the human genome teach us that we share 90% of the genetic makeup of our close relatives, the primates. 90%. Professor David Mumbaugh of Meadville Lombard Theological School, one of my favorite professors, now retired, points out that our genome structure is not markedly different from that of fruit flies and mustard plants. We are intimately related to every living thing that creeps, crawls, or flies. Chemistry teaches us that we are made of the same basic elements as the stars and the planets. Or again, as Professor Mumbaugh more elegantly puts it, we are all recycled stardust. Physicists theorize that all of this emerged from one singular moment of creation, the Big Bang, producing all the matter and energy now present in the universe. But where does this leave then traditional Orthodox religion and the idea of God? From the beginning, traditional Christianity saw evolution and the work of Copernicus and Galileo as direct challenges to its hegemony over the mind and spirit of its followers and the world in general. Humans were no longer the central point of creation, but only one part of it. If indeed God did not set in motion a story that leads inexorably to the death and resurrection of Jesus, then the entire Christian enterprise falls of its own weight. At least this has been the conclusion of many fundamentalists and their life. For me, humanism brought a different conclusion. I found that it fit my personal religious beliefs. It fit my rational worldview and my acceptance of scientific inquiry as a way to understand the world. It was a faith stance I could accept without leaving the rest of me at the door on Sunday morning. In its incarnation as religious humanism, it provided me with a community in which I could worship, feel cared for, and care for others. It grounded my personal social justice activism. And yet, something was missing. There was a more that was still not there. I was confronted with this sense of the more during my early chaplaincy training. One of my colleagues challenged me one day. She said, and I paraphrase, "You know, Jim, I find a lot in your beliefs that are attractive and make sense, but I can't really accept them because I find no sense of the sacred or the holy." Now, sometimes I'm not real quick on the uptake. I've had to work hard to find an answer to my friend's question. And I'm not the only one who has struggled with this. In his essay in the collection A Language of Reverence, Professor Mumbaugh notes that religious humanists have, in his words, manned the ramparts of reason and are prepared to defend the citadel of the mind against a renewal of superstition. And yet in this defense, Professor Mumbaugh says, religious humanists have lost the vocabulary of reverence, the ability to speak of that which is sacred, holy, of ultimate importance to us. Put another way, in a religious outlook that values rationality and the scientific method, is there room for the holy and the sacred? More and more persons who are coming to religious liberalism in general, and Unitarian Universalism in particular, find a need for more spiritual depth in their lives. They are not content to look at the world with a rational, mechanistic analysis. At the same time, a God-centered outlook does not satisfy them either. I was certainly one of these persons. Throughout history, the natural world has been a source of the sacred and the holy for many of us. For me, experiences like the one I described in the Boundary Waters reflects that sense of the sacred, the divine, the holy. No matter one's personal theology, the sense of awe and reverence we feel in the presence of the natural world, it is much a religious experience, as many find in churches or synagogues or mosques or temples. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of our transcendentalist forebears, was one of them. He put it this way: "In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I find nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and lifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. So how might the rationalism of humanism and the sense of the sacred be reconciled? Now please note that by sacred I do not mean something from a supernatural realm. Rather, I mean a way of looking at the world that rejects a purely materialistic analysis. I mean a way of looking at the world that finds in a 300-year-old tree a value beyond its board feet of lumber or the number of pieces of teak furniture that can be made from it. Sacred to me is finding something in the material world that transcends our existence. Reverend Murray suggests what he calls humanistic religious naturalism as one response to the need for the sacred. Humanistic religious naturalism begins with religious humanism, which Murray sums up in these words: the affirmation of the worth and dignity of every person, a commitment to human betterment, and the necessity for human beings to take responsibility for themselves and the world. And for Murray, religious humanism again brings humanists into community for mutual support and sustenance. Religious humanism differs from secular humanism because the religious variety is more open to mystery and more likely to respond with reverence and gratitude at the wonder of being alive. It is in the sense of community, the openness to mystery, that religious humanism, in Murray's view and mine, distinguishes itself from secular humanism. Historically, humanism has had, in my view, a couple of problems. First of all, it has tended towards a sterile rationalism that has lost a sense of mystery and wonder. Second, it has been too human-centered, seeing man, in quotes, as the measure of all things. This has allowed for a utilitarian view of the world that may not resonate with our environmental consciousness that has emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century, and that is reflected in our Unitarian Universalist seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. For Murray and others, an answer to both criticisms is to join religious humanism with another point of view called religious naturalism. Professor Jerry Stone, another teacher at Meadville, defines religious naturalism in this way. Negatively, religious naturalism asserts that there seems to be no distinct and superior realm, such as God, soul, or heaven, to ground or explain or give meaning to this world. Positively, it affirms that attention should be focused on this world to provide whatever explanation and meaning are possible for this life. Religious naturalism sees human beings as one part of a multitudinous natural world where mind and body are one. Life is transient, and therefore we must make joy in it and make our life as meaningful and joyful as possible. Religious naturalism is not antagonistic towards science, nor does it try to simply fit its views into new scientific discoveries. Rather, religion and science are in constant dialogue, learning from one another, and resulting in a scientifically informed religious perspective. For religious naturalists like Murray, the grand organizing story is not the 7 days of creation in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. Rather, there is the epic of cosmic evolution that begins with the Big Bang and shows the universe as a single reality, one spectacular process of change and development. It is a universal story for humankind, not limited to any one tribe or culture, but rather everybody's story. It is a story that shows we are all members of one family who are responsible for one another as the evolutionary process continues. It gives meaning and purpose to our lives. Now here's a religious outlook that I could latch on to. It appealed to my rational scientific side, but at the same time it connected me to something greater than myself. Some humanists suggest that religious naturalism is nothing more than making God out of the natural world, a kind of pantheism. I don't see it that way. Recognizing myself as a part of nature along with all other animate and inanimate objects, allows me to be part of something larger without that something being supernatural. It is the more that I was looking for. Humanistic religious naturalism also provides an ethical basis for caring for this one and only natural world that we have. I'm sure we all recall that iconic picture of the Earth taken on one of the lunar expeditions of the 1970s, showing the Earth as a big blue marble suspended in space. The image shows us just how fragile the Earth is. Hanging there in the black void of space, we see how alone our home planet is in the vast cosmos. In recent years, thanks to discoveries in astronomy, we have learned how improbable the survival of life on this planet really is. We might call it the Goldilocks effect. Not too hot, not too cold, but rather just right. Other planets in the universe may have sustained life in the past or now harbor living beings. But we are only beginning to learn what an improbable combination of factors had to come together to support life here. Yet even with that knowledge, we don't care for our home that we have. We pollute the waters and poison the atmosphere. We denude the planet of minerals so that we can support our overconsumption. And we fail to heed the warnings that nature itself gives us, such as those that point to the destructive effect of global warming and our human complicity in the process. A few summers ago, I stood by the shores of what had been Lake Delton in the Wisconsin Dells, destroyed by the unusually heavy rains of that spring and summer. I wondered if the climate change in which we humans are complicit had anything to do with its destruction. We claim to think of the earth as a temple, yet we treat her in ways that we hopefully would never treat our own churches or other sacred sites. Can you imagine polluting the air and the water and the grounds of this church in the same way we do to our planet that we live on? Humanistic religious naturalism, or its theistic cousin, can provide a religious and spiritual basis for caring for our planet and all of the creatures and dwell on it. And that is enough of the divine and sacred for me. And so this is where my personal journey has brought me at this particular point in my life. Is this journey over? I suspect not. I tend to have a restless spirit, and I don't do very well as a true believer. That's probably why I am a Unitarian Universalist, and why our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, resonates with me. And so I'll probably get back in my canoe, find another lake, and see if there are any other insights to carry me on a further quest. And so I'm going to bring a chair out here so I can sit down.